In May of 1453, the last emperor of the Byzantine Empire took off his crown so no one would know who he was and walked into the battle to die with his city. The empire behind him had lasted over 1,000 years. The civilization behind that had lasted 3,000. What happened in those 3,000 years between the first Bronze Age palace builders and that final street fight in Constantinople is one of the most extraordinary stories in human history. Tonight we tell all of it, but before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It is a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you are joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now let us begin. We go back, far back. 3,000 years before that dying emperor, before the philosophy and the democracy and the marble temples, someone on a small Mediterranean island was doing something that should not have been possible. They were building a city, not a village, not a camp. A city with multi-story buildings, paved streets, clay pipes running fresh water through the walls, and drainage systems carrying waste away beneath the floors. This was Crete, around 2000 BC, and the people who built it had no name for themselves that we know of. We call them the Minoans, a name invented by an archaeologist named Arthur Evans, who excavated their greatest site in the early 20th century. He named them after Minos, the mythical king the ancient Greeks believed had ruled this island in the distant past. The Minoans themselves left no label we can read. They left something more haunting. They left a writing system no one has ever deciphered. Think about that for a moment. These people wrote things down. Thousands of inscriptions pressed into clay, carved into stone, using a script called Linear A, and we cannot read a single word. Their language does not belong to any known family. It is not Greek. It is not related to Egyptian or Sumerian, or anything we can match to a known tongue. They spoke and wrote and recorded the details of their world, and that world is sealed from us. What we have instead is everything else they left behind. And what they left behind is extraordinary. The palace at Knossos, the greatest Minoan site, had a population that may have reached 100,000 people at its height, around 1600 BC, 100,000. In the Bronze Age, on an island, the palace complex itself sprawled across multiple stories, with interior staircases, large storage chambers, and columns built upside down, wider at the top than the base, painted red, mounted on stone bases. The smell of olive oil was everywhere. Storage jars taller than a man lined room after room, filled with grain, wine, oil. The Minoans were traders. They sailed beyond the Aegean to Egypt and Syria. Minoan craftsmen painted frescoes in the palaces of Egyptian elites. Their pottery turned up from the Iberian Peninsula to the Levantine coast. They were, at their peak, possibly the dominant commercial force in the Mediterranean world. And yet their art tells a story that feels almost dreamlike. No images of kings. No scenes of conquest or triumph. What you see instead are dolphins and octopuses, spreading across pottery in swirling motion, women in elaborate flounced skirts with their hair falling in long tresses, bull leapers mid-flight over the backs of charging animals, flowers growing in painted meadows. Minoan figures seem to move. They have what one scholar described as the ability to create an atmosphere of life while following formal conventions. The art feels ecstatic, alive, like it was made by people who genuinely loved the world they inhabited. Women appear everywhere in that art, not as background figures, as officiants, as leaders, as the dominant religious authorities. Evidence suggests that Minoan society may have been governed by a college of priestesses, a theocracy of sorts, with female figures holding political and spiritual power in ways that had no parallel in the ancient world. Two famous figurines from Knossos show women holding snakes, their arms outstretched, their gaze direct and utterly unafraid. They do not look like decorations. They look like they are in charge. Then, around 1600 BC, the ground shook. The volcano on the island of Thera, what we now call Santorini, erupted with a force measuring 7 on the volcanic explosivity index. It ejected up to 100 cubic kilometers of material. It buried entire Cycadic settlements in ash. Coastal areas of Crete were abandoned, and yet Knossos survived. The Minoans rebuilt. They expanded. For another century and a half, Minoan civilization continued to flourish, producing some of its most ambitious architecture and most striking art in the period after the eruption. But something was changing. Something on the mainland was rising. On the Greek mainland, around 1600 BC, a different kind of civilization was taking shape. These were the Mycenaeans, and where the Minoans left almost no images of warriors or conquest, the Mycenaeans left almost nothing else. Their elite dead were buried in shaft graves cut deep into the earth at Mycenae, and what went into those graves tells you everything you need to know about who these people were. Gold death masks pressed over the faces of kings, swords with hilts decorated in gold and silver, daggers inlaid with elaborate hunting scenes, armor, spears, the bones of men who had spent their lives preparing for violence. The walls they built around their citadels were so massive that later Greeks could not believe human hands had made them. They called the style Cyclopean, after the mythical one-eyed giants, because only giants could have moved stones 8 meters thick and weighing several tons. Stand at Mycenae today and look at those walls. The air is dry and the stone is warm from the sun. The Lion Gate, with its carved relief of 2 lions rearing up over a column, still stands at the entrance. It was built around 1200 BC. It was already ancient when the classical Greeks walked past it. The Mycenaeans absorbed Minoan culture and transformed it. They borrowed the writing system and adapted it to write their own language, an early form of Greek. This adapted script, Linear B, was deciphered in 1952 by a young architect named Michael Ventris. When he cracked the code, he discovered something astonishing. The tablets recorded not epic poetry, not history, not the words of kings. They recorded sheep, wool allocations, ration distributions, tax records, the grinding administrative detail of a palace economy, meticulously organized, deeply bureaucratic, built to track every jar of oil and every bolt of cloth in a kingdom. The Mycenaeans ran an empire on paperwork. By around 1450 BC, Mycenaean elites had moved into Knossos itself. The language of administration on Crete shifted to Mycenaean Greek. The hybrid culture that followed lasted another 3 centuries, but the Minoans, as a distinct civilization, had effectively been absorbed. Their writing system, Linear A, fell out of use. Their language was silenced. The great palace complexes of Phaistos and Katozakros were destroyed. Only Knossos remained in use, and even it was eventually burned. Then, around 1200 BC, something happened that no one has ever fully explained. And it was not just in Greece. It was everywhere. Within 50 years, almost every major palace civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed simultaneously. Mycenae was destroyed. Tiryns was destroyed. Pylos was burned, its Linear B tablets preserved only because the fire that destroyed the palace baked the clay they were written on. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, one of the great powers of the ancient world, collapsed entirely. Ugarit, the great trading city on the Syrian coast, was burned and never rebuilt. In Egypt, the pharaoh Ramses III fought off waves of invaders he called the Sea Peoples, mysterious groups of raiders whose identity historians still debate. He won, but barely, and the world around him had already fallen. Trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean for centuries simply vanished. Literacy disappeared. The complex administrative systems that the Mycenaeans had built, the palace economies, the scribal schools, the road networks, all of it went silent. In Greece, the population collapsed. Settlements were abandoned. People moved to defensible hilltops and scratched out survival in small, isolated villages. The shaft graves were sealed. The gold death masks lay in the dark. The lion gate stood over an empty citadel. Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages, 4 centuries of it. From roughly 1100 BC to around 800 BC, there's almost no writing, almost no monumental architecture, almost no evidence of long-distance trade. The civilization that had built Knossos and Mycenae, that had traded with Egypt and painted frescoes for pharaohs, that had buried its kings in gold and kept meticulous records in 2 separate writing systems, had effectively ceased to exist. The memory of what came before faded into myth. The great walls of Mycenae became the work of giants. The palace at Knossos became the labyrinth of the Minotaur. The kings became heroes. The heroes became gods. And the people who had actually built those walls and walked those corridors and pressed those tablets into clay became figures in stories told around fires by people who had no idea they were remembering something real. In one of those stories, a king sails to war across the wine-dark sea. His name is Agamemnon. He comes from Mycenae. He leads a coalition of Greek kings to besiege a great city. He is away for 10 years. When he comes home, his wife kills him. Homer would tell that story 4 centuries later, and the Greeks who heard it believed it was history. They were right, just not in the way they knew. The Minoans built a civilization on an island in the middle of a sea, and traded with the known world, and governed through priestesses, and wrote in a language no one has ever read. The Mycenaeans built walls that looked like the work of giants, and buried their kings in gold, and ran their empire on clay tablets, and may have fought a war that became the most famous story in Western literature. And then, in the space of 50 years, both of them were gone. For 4 centuries, Greece was dark. No writing, no kings, no memory of what had come before. But in that darkness, something was quietly being born. Something that would change the world in ways no Bronze Age king ever imagined. All it needed was a spark. The darkness lasted 400 years. Then slowly, the lights came back on. Not all at once, not with a trumpet blast or a king's proclamation. It happened the way a fire catches in wet wood, slowly, stubbornly, one small flame at a time. Imagine a coastal village somewhere on the Aegean shore around 800 BCE. The great palaces are gone. The clay tablets are gone. The gold burial masks are gone. What remains are stone walls being swallowed by grass, and people who have forgotten that their ancestors once traded with Egypt and wrote in 2 separate scripts and built fortifications that later generations would call the work of giants. Those people are gone from memory. What is left is simpler, smaller. A fishing boat, a cooking fire, the smell of salt water and wood smoke drifting together in the dark. Then a merchant arrives. He comes from the coast of what we now call Lebanon. He is Phoenician, and scratched onto the clay tablet he carries are symbols, not pictures, not the complex syllabic signs of the lost Mycenaean world. Something new, something leaner, 22 characters that can be combined to write anything a human voice can say. The Greeks look at those symbols and something stirs. They take the Phoenician alphabet and they do what Greeks will do for the next 1,000 years. They improve it. They add vowels, which the Phoenician system lacked, turning a trading tool into something capable of capturing the full music of human speech. For the first time in 4 centuries, someone in the Greek world picks up a stylus and writes a sentence down. Greece has memory again. And with memory comes everything else. Population grows. Trade routes reopen. Ships push out from islands and peninsulas into waters their grandfathers had been too fragmented and too fearful to cross. From around 750 to 500 BCE, Greeks plant colonies in every direction. To the east, along the coast of Asia Minor, to the west, into Sicily and southern Italy, a region so thick with Greek settlements it earns the name Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Modern Syracuse, Naples, Marseille, and Istanbul all begin as Greek colonies in this period. The population of the Greek world swells from perhaps 800,000 people to somewhere between 7 and 10 million. A civilization that had almost ceased to exist is now spreading across the known world like ink dropped into water. But what kind of civilization? What values will hold it together? That question gets answered by a blind poet, or a poet people said was blind. His name is Homer. And sometime around 800 BCE, he composes or codifies 2 epic poems that will define what it means to be Greek for the next millennium, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They are not new stories. They are the distilled memory of the Bronze Age, the echo of real kings and real wars, filtered through 4 centuries of oral tradition, passed mouth to ear around fires by people who had no idea they were remembering something true. Homer gives those memories shape and weight and moral force. He tells the Greeks who their heroes were, what those heroes valued: courage, honor, fate, the glory of action and the grief that follows it. Every Greek boy who grows up hearing those poems grows up with the same heroes in his head. The shared imaginative world becomes the glue of a civilization that has no single king, no unified state, no central authority of any kind. Because that is the other thing the Dark Ages produce. The polis. Greece is a mountainous country. Valleys separated by ridges. Coastlines broken by inlets. The geography does not encourage large kingdoms. It encourages small, fierce, independent communities. And so, as the Archaic period takes shape in the 8th century BCE, the defining political unit of Greek civilization becomes not an empire or a kingdom, but the city-state. The polis, a city and the land around it, governing itself, defending itself, defining its own laws and its own identity. There are eventually hundreds of them. Each one is its own world. Each one is convinced it is the center of the universe. They are not peaceful worlds. Far from it. The polis is born into conflict because every city-state is run, in these early centuries, by aristocrats. Old families men who own the land and control the courts and decide who owes what to whom. And below them, pressing upward with increasing desperation, are the farmers and the debtors, and the men who work soil they do not own and can never buy free, because the interest on their debts compounds faster than their harvests can grow. Athens in the early 6th century BCE is a city on the edge of civil war. The tension has been building for decades. The poor are being enslaved for debt, not metaphorically enslaved. Literally, a man who cannot pay what he owes can be seized along with his family and sold. Athens is eating itself. The aristocrats who control the courts keep ruling in favor of the aristocrats who own the land, and the people at the bottom have nowhere to turn and nothing left to lose. That is the most dangerous kind of anger, the kind that has stopped caring about consequences. Both sides somehow agree on one man. His name is Solon. He is an Athenian of noble birth but modest means. A poet, a traveler, a man with a reputation for wisdom and, more importantly, for fairness. In 594 BCE, both the aristocrats and the poor hand him emergency powers and ask him to fix what is broken. Both sides assume he will tilt toward them. Both sides are wrong. What Solon does next has never been done before in recorded history. He cancels the debts, all of them. Every Athenian who has been enslaved for debt is freed. Every plot of land seized as collateral is returned. He calls this the sackthea, the shaking off of burdens. He then rewrites the law code entirely, replacing the savage statutes of Draco with something more humane. He divides the citizen body into 4 property classes, with different rights and responsibilities for each. Even the poorest citizens gain the right to attend the assembly and to vote. The Areopagus, the ancient council of aristocrats, keeps some of its power as a check on the new institutions, but the principle has shifted. Power is no longer purely a function of birth. It is, at least partly, a function of participation. Then the aristocrats come to him. They have seen what he has done for the poor. Now they want their reward. And the poor come to him too. They have seen what he has done for them. Now they want more. Both sides want him to stay, to take permanent power, to become the kind of strongman ruler the Greeks call a tyrant, which in this era simply means a sole ruler who has seized power outside the traditional rules. Athens is begging him to be its king. Solon looks at them both. He has heard every argument. He has weighed every plea. He says no. He sails away. Voluntarily. Without being forced. Without a coup to remove him. Without an army to stop him. He simply leaves. He travels to Egypt and Cyprus and comes home years later to find his reforms still standing, the city still arguing, still imperfect, still alive. He has planted something in the soil of Athens that has no name yet, a seed that says power belongs to the people who live under it, not to the man strong enough to take it. The city is not yet a democracy, not even close. The aristocrats still dominate the archonships, the high offices of state. The poor still cannot run for the positions that matter most. The reforms have eased the pressure, but not resolved the contradiction at Athens' heart. Civil conflict, what the Greeks call stasis, will continue to tear at the city. A tyrant named Pisistratos will seize power twice, then a third time, and hold it until his death. His son Hippias will inherit the throne. It will take decades more of struggle and betrayal and revolution before the seed Solon planted finally breaks through the surface. But the seed is there, and it is real. Solon left Athens with the idea planted, but not yet rooted. What came next would test whether a city could actually govern itself. The man who would answer that question would do it with a method so brutal and so brilliant that Athens would never be the same again. His name was Clisthenes, and he was about to commit an act of political revolution that the aristocrats who helped him would spend the rest of their lives regretting. Clisthenes is standing in the agora, and the men who put him there are starting to sweat. They had used him. That was the plan. The aristocratic clan of the Alcmaeonids needed a weapon against their rivals, and Clisthenes was sharp enough to serve. They handed him access to the popular assembly, the ecclesia, expecting him to win a factional fight and then settle back into the familiar game of noble families trading power among themselves. What they got instead was a revolution. He does not look like a revolutionary. He is one of them, born to wealth, bred in the corridors of Athenian power. But somewhere in the years of exile and struggle, something had shifted in him. He had watched Solon's reforms strain under the weight of aristocratic ambition. He had watched tyrants rise and fall, and he had arrived at a conclusion so radical it would reshape the world. The problem with Athenian politics was not the wrong men holding power. It was the system that decided who counted as a man worth listening to. Birth, clan, family loyalty. The great houses of Athens had carved the city into their own territories, and every political alliance, every vote, every office traced back to whose blood you carried. Clisthenes picks up a stylus and redraws the map, not the physical map, the political one. He reorganizes all Athenian citizens into 10 new tribes, and here is the brilliant, brutal part. The tribes are artificial. They are designed to cut across family lines, mixing people from the coast with people from the city, with people from the inland farms. Your old clan loyalty means nothing now. Your new tribe is your political identity, and every tribe sends representatives to a new bull of 500, a council that prepares the business of the full assembly. The aristocrats who helped him stare at what he has built, some of them go pale. They had handed the city to its people, and the people had taken it. Athens now has a word for what it is. Democracia, rule by the demos, the citizen body. Not rule by the best families. Not rule by the richest men. Rule by the people who live under the laws. It is around 508 BCE, and nothing like this has existed at this scale before. The air in the agora smells of olive oil and stone dust and the sweat of men arguing about who they are now. Solon planted the seed. Clisthenes grew the tree, and then, before anyone had time to decide whether democracy was actually a good idea, the largest empire in the world came to cut it down. Look east, past the Aegean, past the islands, past the coast of Anatolia. An empire stretches so vast that its eastern border touches India. The Achaemenid Persian Empire under Darius the Great controls perhaps 40 million people. It fields armies that darken the horizon. Its supply trains stretch for miles. When it moves, the ground shakes, and it is moving west. The spark was the Ionian Revolt, Greek city-states on the coast of Anatolia, rising against Persian rule in 499 BCE. Athens had sent ships to help. Those ships had helped burn the Persian regional capital of Sardis. Darius had watched the smoke rise from his burning city, and someone, the story goes, had whispered Athens in his ear. From that moment, Darius kept a servant whose only job was to say those 3 words to him at dinner every night. Remember the Athenians. He remembered. In 490 BCE, a Persian fleet crosses the Aegean. The force that lands on the plain of Marathon is not the full might of Persia. It is an expeditionary army, perhaps 25,000 strong, sent to punish a minor city that had the arrogance to defy the King of Kings. The Persians expect this to take days. The Athenian army that marches out to meet them numbers around 10,000 hoplites. Citizen soldiers, men who bought their own armor, who fight in the tight formation called the phalanx, shield locked to shield, spear points forward. Farmers and craftsmen and merchants, men who had voted in the ecclesia last month, now standing on a coastal plain with Persian archers filling the sky. The Athenian generals debate whether to fight or wait. One of them, Miltiades, argues for attack. His voice is steady. His hands, inside bronze gauntlets, are knots. They attack at a run. The phalanx moves faster than any Persian commander expects, closing the distance before the archers can break them. The Persian center buckles. The Athenian wings wrap around. It is over in hours. 6,400 Persians die on that plain. The Athenians lose 192 men. A runner named Phidippides, who had already run to Sparta and back to beg for help that never came, now runs 26 miles to Athens to deliver the news. Victory. Then he falls down dead. The Athenians bury their dead at Marathon itself. They raise a mound over them that you can still see today. They go home believing they have stopped something. They have not. They have only delayed it. 10 years pass. The democracy deepens. The poorest Athenians, the men who rode the war galleys, gain more political voice. The city builds a fleet. Dozens of triremes, long, sleek warships powered by 170 oarsmen each, their rhythm like a heartbeat, the smell of pine tar and salt water filling every harbor. And in Persia, Darius dies. His son Xerxes inherits the throne and inherits the grudge. What Xerxes assembles is not an expeditionary force. It is an invasion. Ancient sources claim over 1 million men. Modern historians say the number was probably closer to 150,000 to 250,000. But even the lower figure is staggering. It is the largest military force the ancient world has ever seen. Xerxes built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe, lashing 360 ships together side by side so his army can walk across the water into Greece. When a storm destroys the first bridge, he orders the sea itself whipped in punishment, 300 lashes. Then he builds another bridge. The Greek city-states scramble for a response. Many of them simply submit. The word the Greeks use is medizing, going over to the Mede, and dozens of Polays do it without a fight, calculating that resistance is suicide. The ones that refuse gather at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where the mountains come down to within meters of the sea, where a small force can hold against a vast one. Sparta sends its king. Leonidas arrives with 300 Spartans, his personal royal guard, plus several thousand allied Greek soldiers. He takes one look at the pass and sets his shield down. He is not going anywhere. For 2 days, the Persian army breaks against that narrow throat of land. The hoplite formation is devastating in close quarters. Persian soldiers die in waves. Xerxes watches from his golden throne on the hillside, and twice he stands up from it in disbelief. He sends in his elite troops, the Immortals, 10,000 of the finest soldiers in the empire. They come back. On the third day, a local Greek named Ephialtes leads a Persian column through a mountain path around the pass. Leonidas hears the news. He sits with the information for a moment. His face tells you everything without saying a word. He sends most of the allied Greeks away. The Spartans stay. Some Thespians and Thebans stay with them. They know what is coming. The Persians surround them on both sides, and the last Spartans die fighting, the sources say, with their hands and teeth when their spears broke. Thermopylae falls. The road to Athens is open. The Athenians evacuate their city. This is perhaps the most extraordinary decision of the entire war, and the most painful. Women and children loaded onto boats sent to the island of Salamis and the shores of the Peloponnese. Old men who refuse to leave, priests who stay to tend the temples. The city empties out, and then the Persian army walks in. They burn it. The temples on the Acropolis, the homes, the agora where Cleisthenes had once redrawn the map of Athenian power. All of it reduced to ash and blackened stone. The smoke rises for days. On the island of Salamis, Athenian refugees watch their city burn across the water, and the silence is the loudest sound any of them have ever heard. But the fleet is intact, and the fleet is everything. The Athenian commander, Themistocles, has maneuvered the allied Greek fleet around 370 triremes into the narrow strait between Salamis and the mainland. He has done something clever and cold-blooded. He has sent a message to Xerxes, pretending to defect, urging the Persians to attack immediately before the Greeks scatter. Xerxes believes him. The Persian fleet, over 600 ships, enters the strait in the dark before dawn. The Greeks are waiting. In the narrow channel, numbers mean nothing. 600 ships cannot maneuver. They crowd each other, oars tangling, hulls grinding together. The Greek triremes, lighter and more nimble, ram into them again and again. The bronze prows punch through Persian hulls at the waterline. Men pour into the sea screaming. The smell of blood and splintered wood fills the strait. The sound of timber cracking carries all the way to the shore where Xerxes watches on his throne, watching his navy die. It is the autumn of 480 BCE. By the time the sun sets, the Persian fleet is broken. Xerxes leaves Greece. He takes most of his army with him, leaving a large force under his general Mardonius to winter in the north and finish the job in spring. But the job never gets finished. In 479 BCE, at the plain of Plataea in Boeotia, the largest Greek land army ever assembled meets Mardonius and his forces. The Spartans anchor the line. The fighting is brutal and confused, the kind of battle that has no elegance, only weight and endurance, and the willingness to hold your ground when everything in your body is begging you to run. Mardonius dies in the fighting. When their general falls, the Persian army breaks. The invasion is over. The Greeks have won. Let that settle for a moment, because it almost did not happen. A collection of quarreling city-states, perpetually suspicious of each other, chronically unable to agree on anything, had just turned back the largest empire on earth. The free city, the city that let its citizens vote and argue and accuse their own leaders of corruption, had beaten the King of Kings. Athens comes home to ash. The temples are gone. The houses are gone. But the people are alive, and the fleet is intact, and the idea that had been planted by Solon and grown by Clisthenes and tested in fire is still standing. They begin to rebuild on the Acropolis, on the scorched rock above the city. They will eventually raise the Parthenon, a temple so perfect it seems to argue with the sky. A monument built on the ashes of everything Xerxes burned. The democracy had survived the greatest external threat it would ever face. The men who had rowed the triremes at Salamis, the poorest Athenians, the ones who could not afford hoplite armor, they had saved Greece. They come home knowing it. They will not be quiet about it. In the decades that follow, their political voice grows louder and the democracy deepens further, becoming more radical, more participatory, more genuinely ruled by its citizens than any system before or since. Athens is now the dominant power in the Aegean. It had funded the war, led the strategy, built the fleet that broke Persia. The other Greek states look at Athens and see a city that is rich, confident, and increasingly unwilling to pretend it is just one voice among equals. Athens forms the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states nominally created to defend against future Persian aggression. The treasury sits on the island of Delos. The contributions flow in from dozens of member cities. Then Athens moves the treasury to Athens. It is a small thing, a practical thing, the Athenians say, safer there, more efficient. But the other Greeks feel it, especially Sparta. Sparta had fought at Thermopylae and Plataea. Spartan soldiers had anchored the line, had died in the pass, had held when others broke. Sparta had its own system of governance, its own vision of what Greek life should look like, its own network of allies in the Peloponnese. And Sparta is watching Athens grow richer and more powerful with every passing year, watching Athenian democracy spread its influence across the Aegean like a tide, and Sparta does not like what it sees. Greece had defeated the empire of the world, but the Greeks had made a mistake that empires always make, and free cities always forget. They had looked outward at their enemy and not inward at each other. And what was growing inside Greece, between Athens and Sparta, between democracy and oligarchy, between two visions of what the Greek world should be, was a war that would be worse than anything Persia had ever done to them. They would do it to themselves. Picture the Acropolis in the summer of 447 BCE. Cranes groan against a blue sky. Marble dust hangs in the air like flour, white and sharp in your throat. 10,000 workers, slaves and free men, side by side, haul stone blocks up the sacred hill, while the city below hums with money, argument, theatre, and the restless noise of a people who believe they are inventing the future. They are not wrong. Athens had defeated the greatest empire on earth. Now it was spending the profits. Pericles had taken the tribute money flowing in from across the Aegean. The silver coins of dozens of subject cities paid into the Delian League's treasury and pointed at the ruined hilltop above the city. "Build," he said, "build something that will outlast us all." What rose from that hill was the Parthenon. 46 columns of white Pentelic marble, sculptures by Phidias so alive they seemed to breathe. A statue of Athena inside so tall, so covered in ivory and gold, that her helmet's crest was visible from ships still miles out at sea. It was the most expensive building project in Greek history, and Athens paid for it with other people's money. The allies who had signed up to fight Persia together were now, in effect, funding the decoration of Athens. They noticed. They said nothing. Not yet. But Pericles did not stop at stone. Walk through Athens in 440 BCE and tell me what you see. Sophocles is rehearsing a new tragedy in the theatre of Dionysus. His actors masked and enormous, their voices trained to fill 10,000 seats. Herodotus has come to the city from Halicarnassus, carrying his histories in his head, reading them aloud to crowds who press close to hear about Egypt and Persia and the edges of the world. Hippocrates is on the island of Kos, but his students walk the streets of Athens, arguing about the body, about disease, about whether illness is divine punishment or something that can be explained, predicted, cured. Thucydides, still a young man, watches all of it and says nothing yet. He is saving it. Socrates, barefoot, ugly by his own admission, wearing the same rough cloak in summer and winter, stops strangers in the agora and asks them to define justice. Most of them find him irritating. He keeps asking anyway. This is the golden age. The phrase sounds like something carved above a door, but stand inside it and it feels like electricity. Athens is simultaneously the freest city and the most intellectually alive city that has ever existed. Citizens vote on everything. Generals are elected and can be removed. The poorest man in Athens has a political voice equal in weight to the richest. Pericles stands before the assembly and tells them in the words Thucydides would later record, that Athens is the school of Greece. He is not being modest. He means it as a statement of fact, and for roughly 30 years it is true. The shadow falls slowly. That is the cruelest part. You do not notice it at first because the light is so bright. Athens is rich, creative, powerful, and increasingly unable to distinguish between confidence and arrogance. The Delian League has quietly become an Athenian empire. Member states that try to leave are forced back in by Athenian warships. The tribute money does not go toward defending Greece anymore. It goes toward the Parthenon, toward Athenian festivals, toward the wages of Athenian jurors and assembly members, so that even the poorest citizen can afford to participate in democracy. The allies are paying for someone else's democracy. That is the thing the Athenians cannot see or will not see. Pericles looks at the gaps between what Athens says it is and what Athens actually does, and he says nothing. He adjusts his strategy. He builds more walls. In 431 BCE, Sparta runs out of patience. The war begins the way most catastrophes begin, not with a single dramatic act, but with a series of small provocations that each side uses to justify what it already wanted to do. Corinth, a Spartan ally, has disputes with Athens over colonies. Athens issues economic sanctions against Megara. Incidents multiply, and underneath all of it, the real cause, which Thucydides names with the precision of a surgeon, the growth of Athenian power, and the alarm it inspires in Sparta. Pericles has a strategy. It is, on paper, a brilliant one. Athens will not fight Sparta on land. Spartan hoplites are the finest soldiers in the world, and everyone knows it. Instead, Athens retreats behind its long walls, the massive fortifications connecting the city to its port at Piraeus, and waits. The Athenian fleet raids the Peloponnesian coast. Sparta ravages Attica, burning farms and olive groves that Athenian citizens can see smoking from the top of their walls. Pericles tells the Athenians to endure it. The fleet will win the war. The walls will hold. This is the price of victory. The Athenians believe him. They pull the people from the countryside inside the walls. Farmers who have worked the same land for generations abandon their homes and crowd into the city. Sleeping in temples, in the spaces between the long walls, anywhere they can find a patch of ground. Athens swells. The streets fill with the smell of too many people in too small a space, unwashed bodies and cook fires and livestock brought in from the farms, and underneath it all something else, something no one can name yet. Then the plague arrives. 430 BCE. It comes in through the port, Piraeus, carried on ships from the east, and it moves through the crowded city like fire through dry grass. Thucydides describes it with clinical, horrifying precision because he survives it himself. The body burns. The eyes go red. The throat bleeds. The skin blisters and breaks. People tear off their clothes because the heat inside them is unbearable. They throw themselves into wells seeking cold water. They die in the streets. They die in the temples. The doctors die first because they are the ones who get closest. Roughly a quarter of the population of Athens dies. 4,500 soldiers. Countless civilians whose names no one records. The countryside refugees packed inside the walls have no immunity, no space, no clean water, and no way out. The city that prided itself on reason and order watches its people die in ways that defy all reason. Some citizens respond by abandoning every moral code they have. Why save money for tomorrow? Why respect your neighbor's property? Why obey any rule at all if the gods themselves are clearly indifferent? Thucydides watches this collapse of civic virtue with the same cold eye. He turns on everything, and he writes it all down. Pericles watches too. He stands before the assembly and defends his strategy even as the city buries its dead. He is still the most persuasive voice in Athens. But the assembly is angry, grief-soaked, looking for someone to blame. They fine him. They remove him from command. Then, because they have no better option, they re-elect him. Pericles accepts all of it with the stillness of a man who has already made his peace with something. He has lost 2 of his legitimate sons to the plague. He is ill himself. He stands before the assembly one last time, speaks about the greatness of Athens, about why the sacrifice is worth it, about what the city means. Then he goes home. In 429 BCE, the plague takes him too. He is 65 or so, and Athens without him is a different city, smaller, louder, meaner. The war grinds on for a decade. Neither side can land the killing blow. Athenian naval raids, Spartan invasions of Attica, brutal episodes that would have been unthinkable before the war, like the Athenian debate over whether to kill every male citizen of Mytilene after a revolt, a debate Athens almost resolves in favor of mass murder before pulling back at the last moment. A peace is eventually negotiated in 4021 BCE by the Athenian general Nicias, a cautious, deeply religious man who believes in omens and whose hands shake slightly when things go wrong. The Peace of Nicias. It is supposed to last 30 years. It lasts 6 because in Athens a new voice has risen. His name is Alcibiades. He is brilliant, beautiful, reckless, and utterly without scruple. He is also the most charismatic politician Athens has produced since Pericles, and he has an idea. Forget the long war with Sparta. Look west. Look at Sicily. Look at Syracuse, the largest and richest city in the Greek world outside of Athens itself. A Spartan ally, sitting on an island full of grain and silver and strategic possibility. Take Sicily, and Athens controls the Western Mediterranean. Take Sicily, and the war with Sparta is won by starvation and economic strangulation alone. It is a magnificent vision. It is also insane. In 415 BCE, Athens votes to send the largest military expedition in its history across the sea to Sicily. 134 triremes, 5,100 heavy infantry, thousands of sailors, rowers, support troops. It is a city sailing away from itself. Nicias, who opposes the expedition, argues that Athens should ask for more troops and more ships. Hoping the assembly will balk at the cost, the assembly votes to give him everything he asks for. They are that confident. They are that drunk on their own power. The harbor at Piraeus on the morning of departure is one of the great spectacles of the ancient world. The entire fleet pouring libations together at the sound of a trumpet, the prayers rising from 100,000 voices at once. The ships moving out in a line so long the last one leaves before Tiet. The first one has disappeared over the horizon. It is the last great confident moment of Athenian democracy. The disaster unfolds over 2 years with the slow, grinding inevitability of a tragedy, which is appropriate since Athens invented the form. Alcibiades is recalled to face charges of sacrilege before the fleet even reaches Sicily, flees to Sparta, and begins advising the enemy. Nicias, ill and indecisive, cannot bring himself to retreat when retreat is still possible. Spartan reinforcements arrive in Sicily under a general named Gylippus. The Athenians, who came to besiege Syracuse, find themselves besieged in turn. Their fleet is destroyed in the harbor. They try to retreat overland and are hunted down. 40,000 men, killed or enslaved. Not a ship returns. Not a general survives. Athens receives the news in silence. Thucydides records that people refused to believe it. Then they believed it. Then they sat in the streets and stared. The city that had built the Parthenon and produced Sophocles and Socrates and Thucydides himself had just voted itself into catastrophe. Democracy had done this. The assembly had cheered. The citizens had raised their hands. The people themselves had sent 40,000 men to die on a foreign island because one beautiful, brilliant, irresponsible man had told them a story they wanted to hear. Athens fights on, battered, bleeding, half-starved. It fights for another decade with a ferocity that is almost more terrible than its former confidence. It survives revolts among its allies. It survives an oligarchic coup at home. It survives the Persians funding Sparta's navy. But it cannot survive Lysander. In 405 BCE, the Spartan admiral destroys the last Athenian fleet at Aegospotami, capturing the grain route from the Black Sea. Athens starves. In 404 BCE, the city surrenders. Sparta dictates the terms. The long walls, those massive fortifications that Pericles had built and trusted and staked everything on, must come down. Every stone. The Athenians stand in the streets and watch. Spartan soldiers work methodically, prying blocks apart, toppling sections that fall with a sound like thunder, dust rising in clouds over the city. And Sparta brings musicians to play flutes while the walls come down. Flutes. The sound of celebration while Athens mourns. The citizens watch their city's defenses dismantled stone by stone, and the silence of the watching crowd is louder than the music. Athens survived, barely, but the city that rebuilt itself was not the city that had built the Parthenon. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. The easy faith that democracy would always choose wisely, that free people would always rise to their best selves, that the city that had defeated Persia could never be defeated by itself. All of it was gone, buried under the rubble of the long walls, and in the agora, a barefoot, ugly, irritating old man was asking questions that the new, fragile, frightened Athens had absolutely no patience for. His name was Socrates, and the city that had once prided itself on free thought was about to kill him for it. The cup is already in his hands. Socrates sits in a prison cell in Athens in 399 date, and he is calm. His friends are not. They weep openly. These men who have followed him through the agora for years, who have watched him dismantle the arguments of generals and politicians with nothing but questions, now they can barely look at him. The smell of the cell is damp stone and old straw. Someone is praying quietly near the door. Socrates holds the hemlock and does not tremble. Athens tore down its own walls, and then, as if that were not enough, it walked into the agora and killed the man who had spent his life asking it to be better. Think about what this city had been. The city of Marathon. The city of the Parthenon. The city of the Parthenon. The city that had looked at the Persian fleet at Salamis and refused to run. This was a city that had once believed with everything it had that free minds asking hard questions were the source of its greatness. And now it was putting that belief on trial. Literally. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. Vague charges. Dangerous charges. The kind of charges you bring when you cannot name the real crime, which was this. Socrates made people feel stupid, and after a decade of catastrophic military defeat, Athens had no patience left for feeling stupid. The jury was 501 citizens, ordinary men, frightened men, many of them still raw from the war, still angry about the losses, still looking for someone to blame. The vote to convict passed by a narrow margin, not a landslide. A narrow margin, which means hundreds of Athenians voted to let him live. That fact does not make the outcome less terrible. It makes it more so. Socrates could have fled. His friends arranged it. The jailer would have looked the other way. But he refused. He had spent his entire life arguing that the law mattered, that the city mattered, that a man who only obeyed the rules he agreed with was not really a citizen at all. He could not abandon that argument now, not at the end, not when it cost him everything. So he drinks, and the room goes quiet except for weeping. And one of the men in that room, a young man named Plato, watches his teacher die and spends the next 50 years trying to answer the question that death planted in him. How does a city that invented democracy murder the man who loved it most? Plato never fully answers it, but the attempt to answer it produces some of the most extraordinary thinking in human history. Athens survived the death of Socrates, but it was diminished. The light that had drawn the whole Greek world to this city, that crackling, restless, argumentative light, it was still burning, but lower now, quieter, and while Athens grieved and argued and turned inward, something was happening far to the north, something that most Athenians, wrapped in their own tragedy, barely noticed until it was too late. Macedonia. To the sophisticated citizens of Athens and Corinth and Thebes, Macedonia was barely Greece. The people there spoke a rough dialect. A king still held power the old way, through strength and loyalty, not through assemblies and votes. The southern Greeks called them semi-barians, and mostly meant it. But in the 350s BCE, a new king came to the Macedonian throne. He had one eye. He had been a hostage in Thebes as a boy, and while he was there, he had watched the greatest general of the age, Epaminondas, and he had learned. His name was Philip. Philip II. and he was the most dangerous man in the Greek world. Philip did not conquer Greece through brute force alone. He was too clever for that. He used diplomacy where it worked, bribery where it was cheaper, and violence only when nothing else would do. He modernized his army with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. He took the traditional Greek phalanx and made it longer, faster, more lethal. His soldiers carried the sarissa, a pike nearly 18 feet long, so that when the Macedonian phalanx locked together, the enemy faced not one row of spear points, but 5, overlapping, an iron wall moving toward them at a walking pace. And then he added cavalry, heavy cavalry, shock cavalry, the kind that hit a weakened enemy flank like a hammer. Philip understood something that Greek city-states had never quite grasped. You did not win battles with one weapon. You won them by combining weapons, by using the phalanx to pin the enemy in place and the cavalry to destroy them. It was a system, brutal, elegant, and nearly impossible to stop. By 338 BCE, Philip had pulled most of Greece into his orbit through a combination of alliance, threat, and outright annexation. Athens and Thebes, the two great powers of the south, finally united against him. They met his army at a place called Chaeronea in Boeotia on a late summer morning. The ground was flat. The air smelled of dry grass and dust. Both sides knew what was at stake. Philip destroyed them. The Athenian left flank broke and ran. The Theban sacred band, those legendary warriors who had never broken in battle, stood their ground and were annihilated to the last man. When it was over, Philip walked the field. Greek political independence ended that day. Not with a long, slow decline, with a single morning. Athens still existed. Thebes still existed. The agoras were still full of argument and philosophy and commerce. But no Greek city would ever again decide its own fate in the way it once had. That era was finished. Philip intended to use his united Greece as a battering ram against Persia, the old enemy, the dream of vengeance that every Greek carried somewhere in their chest. He never got the chance. In 336 BCE, Philip of Macedon was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding, stabbed by a bodyguard. The reasons were murky then and remain murky now. He was 46 years old. His son was 20. And the world held its breath. Alexander. You already know the name. But knowing the name and understanding what he actually did are two very different things. Try to hold the scale of it in your mind for a moment. In 13 years, a single human being, moving on foot and horseback, conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to Egypt to Persia to Afghanistan to the edge of India. He covered more than 17,000 miles. He fought in deserts and mountains and river plains. He never lost a battle, not one. He crossed into Asia in 334 BCE with roughly 40,000 soldiers. He was carrying a copy of the Iliad, annotated by his tutor Aristotle. He slept with it under his pillow alongside a dagger. He wanted to be Achilles. He wanted glory so badly you could feel it radiating off him like heat. His first great test came at the Granicus River in modern Turkey, where a Persian force waited on the opposite bank. Alexander's generals urged caution. He charged the river. He nearly died. A Persian nobleman's axe split his helmet and cut into his skull. His companion Cleitus killed the man before the blow landed fully. Alexander shook the blood from his eyes and kept fighting. That was who he was. Persia fell in stages. At Issus in 333 BCE, Alexander met the Persian king Darius III on a narrow coastal plain. Darius commanded a force many times larger. It did not matter. Alexander drove straight for Darius himself, cutting through the Persian center with the kind of personal ferocity that terrified armies far more than tactics did. Darius fled the field. He left behind his mother, his wife, his daughters. Alexander treated them with extraordinary courtesy. He understood that how you treated a conquered enemy's family was itself a form of power. Egypt welcomed him. The Persians had been harsh rulers there, and when Alexander arrived in 332 BCE, the Egyptians greeted him as a liberator. He founded a city at the mouth of the Nile and named it after himself, Alexandria. It would become the greatest city in the ancient world, home to the largest library ever assembled, a beacon of learning that burned for centuries. He had been in Egypt for a matter of months. Then, east. Always east. Darius was defeated a final time at Gaugamela in 331 BCE on a vast open plain where the Persians finally had the space they needed to use their numbers. It still was not enough. Alexander's oblique charge shattered the Persian line. Darius fled again. He was murdered by his own men shortly after, which robbed Alexander of the clean victory he wanted. He stood over Darius's body and covered it with his own cloak. The gesture was theatrical. It was also sincere. He had wanted to defeat the king of Persia, not inherit a corpse. He pushed into what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. The fighting there was harder than anything before. Not pitched battles, but guerrilla war. Mountain ambushes, sieges in terrain that exhausted even his extraordinary soldiers. The air in those passes was thin and cold and tasted of iron. His men's boots wore through. Their hands cracked in the dry mountain wind. They had been marching for years. By 326 BCE, he was at the Hydaspes River in northern India. He won his last great battle there, against a king named Porus, who fought from the back of war elephants. After the battle, Alexander asked Porus how he wished to be treated. Porus looked at him and said, "As a king treats a king." Alexander made him an ally on the spot, and then his army stopped. They refused to go further. These men who had followed him across the known world, who had crossed deserts and climbed mountains and fought armies 10 times their size, they sat down and said no more. Alexander raged. He wept. He spent 3 days in his tent, hoping they would change their minds. They did not. He turned back. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE. He was 32 years old. The cause was almost certainly fever, possibly typhoid, possibly the accumulated damage of too many wounds and too many years of brutal campaigning. His generals gathered around his bed and asked him who should inherit his empire. He said, "To the strongest." Some accounts say he said nothing at all, just looked at them, and then was gone. His generals were already arguing over his body before it was cold. His empire fractured within a generation, split between the men who had served him, each carving out a kingdom for himself. The unity he had built did not survive him. But what he had scattered across the world could not be gathered back. He had taken the Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek art, and spread it from Egypt to the borders of India. Cities he founded or transformed became centers of learning, of trade, of culture. Greek became the common tongue of an enormous swath of the world. Plato's ideas, the ideas born in the grief of a prison cell in Athens, were now being read and debated in Alexandria, in Antioch, in cities that had not existed a generation before. A new world had been born. The Greeks called it the Hellenistic world, and it would last for centuries, reshaping everything it touched, until a city on the Tiber decided it wanted everything Alexander had built. The Romans were coming, and they would take Greece. But Greece would take them back. Imagine standing inside the greatest library the world had ever seen. The smell of papyrus rolls thick in the air. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls stacked in wooden shelves, stretching back into cool stone corridors. Scholars moving between them, arguing in Greek, gesturing at texts, laughing, disagreeing. This is Alexandria. This is what Alexander's dream looked like when it was fully awake. He had scattered the Greek world across 3 continents, and for a century after his death, it thrived in ways even Athens never had. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt from their gleaming capital on the Mediterranean coast. The Seleucids governed a vast sweep of Asia from Antioch. The Antigonids held Macedonia and cast a long shadow over the Greek city-states below them. 3 great dynasties, 3 competing visions of what the Greek world could be, and between them, an extraordinary flowering of human thought. Euclid worked in Alexandria and laid down the foundations of geometry that students still learn today. Eratosthenes, the chief librarian of Alexandria, calculated the circumference of the earth using shadows and angles and a brilliant mind. He was off by only a few hundred miles. Archimedes sat in Syracuse and invented principles of mathematics and engineering that would not be surpassed for 1,000 years. These were not small achievements. They were the product of a civilization at full stretch, reaching for everything it could grasp, but stretched too far, and something tears. The Hellenistic world was vast, it was brilliant, and it was deeply, fatally fractured. The wars between Alexander's successors began before his body was cold and did not stop for generations. Macedonia fought Egypt. Egypt funded rebellions against Macedonia. The Seleucids pushed west. The Achaean League and the Aetolian League maneuvered for position in a Greece that had lost its old confidence. Sparta refused to join anyone. Athens, once the beating heart of Greek civilization, slowly lost its political power while keeping its prestige. The city became a kind of museum of itself, wealthy, cultivated, proud, and increasingly irrelevant. This was the world that Philip of Macedonia inherited when he came to power in 221 BCE. His people called him the darling of Hellas. He was talented, ambitious, and he saw clearly what was coming. He called it the cloud rising in the west. He was not wrong. Rome had been watching, not passively, deliberately. The Romans had studied Greek culture the way a student studies a teacher, absorbing its philosophy, its architecture, its art, its literature. Roman aristocrats learned Greek as a second language. They collected Greek sculpture. They hired Greek tutors for their children. They admired everything Greek. And then, with the calm efficiency of a civilization that had learned to want things and take them, they decided to own it. Philip made a fatal mistake. In 215 BCE, he allied himself with Hannibal of Carthage, Rome's most dangerous enemy. Rome did not forget. The First Macedonian War ground inconclusively to a halt in 205 BCE. But Macedon was now marked. When Rome finished destroying Carthage in 202 BCE, it turned east. The Second Macedonian War ended at the Battle of Cynoscephalae in 197 BCE. A Roman army under the proconsul Titus Quinctius Flamininus met the Macedonian phalanx in the hills of Thessaly. The phalanx had conquered the known world under Alexander. It was a wall of bronze and iron, bristling with spears 18 feet long, moving like a single organism. Against Rome's flexible legions, fighting in smaller units that could pivot and adapt, it shattered. Philip surrendered his fleet and his ambitions. Flamininus was an unusual man. He genuinely admired Greek culture. He was not a destroyer. And in 196 BCE, at the Isthmian Games, he stood before a crowd of Greeks from across the Hellenistic world and made an announcement: Greece was free. A Roman herald read the proclamation aloud. The crowd erupted. People wept. Some rushed forward just to touch Flamininus. Birds fell stunned from the trees, the ancient sources say, from the sheer force of the noise. But the freedom was a lie. Every Greek city except Rhodes was enrolled in a new league that Rome controlled. Democracies were quietly replaced with aristocratic governments loyal to Rome. Roman garrisons sat at Corinth and Chalcis. The Greeks had traded one master for another. The difference was that this new master smiled while he held the chain. The Seleucid king Antiochus III thought he saw an opportunity. In 192 BCE, he invaded mainland Greece with 10,000 men. Some Greek cities welcomed him as a liberator. He was defeated at Thermopylae in 191 BCE. The Romans pushed his forces back into Asia and crushed them again at Magnesia in 190 BCE. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans had once held a Persian army, now watched a Roman force drive out a Greek-speaking king. The world had turned entirely over. Perseus, Philip's son, inherited the Macedonian throne in 179 BCE and dreamed of reversing everything his father had lost. Rome declared war in 171 BCE and sent 100,000 troops into Greece. Perseus held out for 3 years. In 168 BCE, the Roman commander Lucius Aemilius Paulus met him at Pydna, a coastal city in Macedonia where the Aegean glittered cold and blue beyond the battlefield. The Macedonian phalanx broke. Perseus fled and was captured. He was taken to Rome in chains. The Antigonid dynasty, which had ruled Macedonia since the wars of Alexander's successors, ended on a dusty road outside a city that had once been the center of the world. Macedonia was broken into 4 smaller client states. The Greek cities that had even verbally supported Perseus were punished. Rome's allies Rhodes and Pergamum effectively lost their independence as a reward for their loyalty. This was what Roman friendship looked like up close. Still, the Greeks resisted. In 149 BCE, a man named Andriscus led Macedonia in a final rebellion against Roman rule. It failed within a year. Macedonia became a Roman province, the first Greek territory to suffer that fate. Rome then turned to the Achaean League, the last real stronghold of Greek political independence, and demanded it dissolve. The Achaeans refused. They knew what they were choosing. Many freed their slaves to fight. They declared war on Rome, knowing they could not win. What happened next was not a battle. It was a demonstration. The Roman consul Lucius Mummius marched his army to Corinth in 146 BCE. Corinth was the wealthiest city in Greece, a city of 90,000 people, positioned on its narrow isthmus between 2 seas, controlling the trade routes of the entire Mediterranean. Its harbors were full of ships. its markets full of goods from Egypt, from Syria, from Italy, from Spain. Its temples were famous across the known world. Mummius killed every man in the city. Everyone. He sold the women and children into slavery. He stripped the temples and the public buildings of their art, loaded it onto ships, and sent it to Rome. Then he burned what was left. The smoke from Corinth could be seen for miles across the sea. The smell of burning stone and charred timber drifted out over the water for days. When it cleared, there was almost nothing left. 146 BCE. The same year Rome destroyed Carthage. In a single year, Rome had obliterated the two greatest commercial cities in the Mediterranean world. It was not coincidence. It was a message. This is what happens. This is what we do. Greece was now a Roman protectorate. Roman taxes were imposed. Roman allies governed every city. The land that had produced Socrates, Pericles, Euclid, and Alexander now sent its revenues to the Tiber. And yet, Roman generals walked through the ruins of Corinth and felt something, not guilt. Something more complicated than guilt. Or maybe envy. The art they shipped back to Rome filled their villas and their temples. Roman aristocrats stood in front of Greek statues in their own dining rooms and felt the weight of the civilization that had existed before Rome was anything at all. They built temples in the Greek style. They read Plato and Aristotle. They argued about Stoicism and Epicureanism, philosophies born in the grief and chaos of the very world they had just conquered. In 27 BCE, the Emperor Augustus formally annexed Greece as the Roman province of Achaia. Politically, it was finished, but the tutors teaching Roman children were Greek. The language of philosophy, medicine, and theology across the eastern half of the empire was Greek. The ideas filling Roman minds were Greek ideas, dressed in Latin clothes. Greece had been conquered, but the conquerors were slowly being conquered back. And out of this collision, Roman power, Greek thought, Eastern mysticism, something was about to be born in an obscure corner of the empire that would change the entire story. A new religion was spreading through the Greek-speaking world, and when it reached the throne of Rome, it would do something no army ever had. It would transform Rome into something Greek. It would transform the Roman Empire into Byzantium, and that empire would call itself Roman for 1,000 years. But it would think, pray, argue, and dream in Greek. A new religion had been spreading through the Greek-speaking world, and it reached the throne of Rome on the eve of a battle. The morning was cold. The Tiber mist still clung to the valley when Constantine's soldiers painted a symbol on their shields. Not an eagle, not a wolf, a cross. The year was 312. The place was the Milvian Bridge, just north of Rome. And what happened next would reshape civilization for 2,000 years. Constantine looked at the sky. He made a decision. His forces crossed the bridge and drove his rival Maxentius into the river, where Maxentius drowned in his own armor. Constantine became the sole ruler of the Western Roman Empire, and he credited one god for the victory. Not Jupiter, not Mars, the god of a persecuted minority that had been feeding lines with its members for 3 centuries. Think about what that meant. In a single morning, the most powerful man in the world changed sides. Within a year, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. Christians could worship openly. Their property was returned. Their leaders were invited to the palace. The man who had spent his life burning incense to the old gods now sat across a table from bishops. The smell of the old temples, that thick sweetness of burning offerings, was slowly being replaced by something else. Candles, frankincense, the sound of Greek prayers echoing off stone walls that had once held pagan shrines. The transformation was not instant. Constantine himself moved carefully, keeping one foot in both worlds for years. But the direction was unmistakable. In 325, he summoned bishops from across the empire to a palace in Nicaea, a city in northwestern Asia Minor. They arrived from Egypt and Syria, from Greece and Gaul, some of them still bearing the scars of torture from the last persecution. They sat in the same room as the Emperor of Rome. The Council of Nicaea attempted to unify Christian doctrine, to settle the burning arguments about the nature of Christ that were tearing congregations apart. Constantine sat at the head of the table, listening, occasionally intervening. A man who had grown up worshipping a dozen gods now presided over a debate about the precise relationship between one god and his son. The world was changing, and not slowly. Temples were converted into churches across the Greek-speaking East. Philosophers who had spent their lives arguing about the nature of the soul found themselves drawn into Christian theology, translating Plato into the language of Scripture. The ideas that had been born in the grief and chaos of ancient Athens did not die. They put on new clothes. Greek thought did not disappear into Rome. It survived inside the new faith, shaping it from within, giving it the vocabulary and the intellectual architecture it needed to become a world religion. And then Constantine did something that no one had done before. He picked up a city, not metaphorically. He looked at a small Greek town on a narrow peninsula between two seas, a place called Byzantium, and he decided it would become the new capital of the Roman Empire. He founded it in 324. He consecrated it on May the 11th, 330. He called it New Rome. He divided it, like the old Rome, across 7 hills. He built a senate. He built a hippodrome that seated over 80,000 spectators. He brought marble columns from Athens, from Corinth, from Ephesus. He brought the bronze serpent column from Delphi. He brought statues from Rome itself. He also brought something else. He offered free grain to anyone who settled there. Not just grain. Oil, wine, firewood. He forced his nobles to build houses in the new city. He exempted his best craftsmen from other duties so they could work on his cathedrals. Within a single lifetime, a fishing town became the largest city in the Christian world. The name New Rome did not stick. People called it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Stand on the walls of that city and look around. To the south, the Sea of Marmara, its surface grey and cold in the early morning. To the north, the Golden Horn, the harbour where ships from Egypt and Syria and the Black Sea region unloaded their cargoes. To the west, the land approach, the only direction from which an army could march. Constantine's architects had already begun to think about that. His successors would think harder. The Emperor Theodosius II, in the early 400s, built walls that would become the most sophisticated defensive architecture in the ancient world. A triple line of fortifications, a moat 20 meters wide in places, towers between 20 and 40 meters high, equipped for hurling stone and pouring burning oil. The foundations of those walls went 10 to 20 meters underground, making undermining almost impossible. For 800 years, nothing would breach them. Constantinople was not just a city. It was a statement. It said that the Roman Empire had moved east. It said that the future was Greek. and in 476 the statement became undeniable. That year, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial insignia east to Constantinople. The Western Empire was gone, the city of Rome itself. That 700-year-old engine of civilization was now just another provincial town in a fragmented landscape of barbarian kingdoms. The roads were crumbling. The aqueducts were failing. The Senate met in a building that nobody repaired anymore. But Constantinople stood. The Eastern Empire, Greek in language and culture, Christian in religion, Roman in law and self-understanding, continued without interruption. Its scholars preserved every text the ancient world had produced. Its libraries held the works of Plato and Aristotle, of Euclid and Archimedes, of Homer and Thucydides. Its philosophers were still arguing, still teaching, still writing commentaries on books that had been composed 1,000 years before. The continuity was real. The thread held. This is what those Roman generals had felt, walking through the ruins of Corinth 2 centuries earlier. That complicated feeling, somewhere between awe and envy. They had been right to feel it. Greece had not died. It had moved. It had found a new home in a city on a narrow peninsula between two seas, and that home was now the most important city in the world. The streets of Constantinople smelled of salt water and spices, of bread baking in the imperial bakeries, of incense drifting from the doors of Hagia Sophia. That cathedral, completed by the Emperor Justinian in 537, was unlike anything human beings had ever built. Its dome seemed to float above the nave, held up, people said, by God alone. When Justinian entered it on the day of its consecration, he looked up at the dome and said something remarkable. He said, "I have surpassed you, Solomon." A Roman emperor standing in a Greek city, quoting a Hebrew king. That was Constantinople. That was what 3,000 years of civilization looked like when it compressed itself into a single moment. By the end of Constantine's reign, the new capital already held 30 palaces and temples, more than 4,000 significant buildings for the nobility, a hippodrome, a circus, 2 theaters, more than 150 baths. Within a century, the population had reached several 100,000. Ships arrived from Egypt carrying grain, from Persia carrying silk, from India carrying spices. The harbor never emptied. The city never slept. And it survived. That is the word that matters, while the Western Empire bled out across decades of barbarian pressure, while Rome itself was sacked twice, while the roads fell silent and the cities shrank, Constantinople held. It held against the Avars and the Persians in 626, when a 300,000-strong army surrounded its walls and the defenders used Greek fire to burn the enemy fleet in the Golden Horn. It held against the Arab sieges of the 7th century, when the Umayyad Caliphate sent fleets of 1,000 ships against its harbor chain. It held against earthquakes and plagues and civil wars and the kind of internal violence that would have destroyed a lesser state, the kind where emperors were blinded and deposed and exiled to monasteries while their successors took the throne in a single bloody night. The empire that historians would eventually call Byzantine never called itself that. It called itself Roman. Its emperors signed their decrees as Roman emperors. Its soldiers fought under Roman standards, but the language was Greek. The faith was Eastern Orthodox. The art was mosaics of gold on dark walls. not marble statues in sunlit forums. Something new had been born from the collision of Roman power and Greek thought and Eastern Christianity. Something that would last 1,000 years. The thread that had begun in the Bronze Age, on the shores of the Aegean, with farmers and traders and the first tentative experiments in written language, had survived. The thread that ran through Mycenae and Athens and Alexander's campaigns and the long humiliation of Roman conquest. The thread that the conquerors had themselves been unable to cut because they needed it too much, had found its way into this city on the Bosphorus. The continuity was not perfect. Nothing human ever is. But it was real. For 1,000 years, Constantinople would be the most important city in the world. It would survive sieges, plagues, civil wars, religious schisms, and the collapse of everything around it. But it could not survive forever, and the force that would eventually destroy it was being born at that very moment in the deserts to the east. A new faith, a new empire, and a general named Mehmed, who would not stop until the walls came down. The scaffolding went up before the foundation had fully cured. Thousands of workers swarmed the hill above the Bosphorus, hauling stone and timber and brick in the early morning dark. The smell of wet mortar hung over the city like fog. Justinian I, Emperor of the Romans, had commissioned the greatest church in the world. He gave his architects 5 years to build it. They finished in 4 years and 10 months. When Justinian walked through the doors of the completed Hagia Sophia in December of 537, he stopped. He looked up at the dome floating above him, 180 feet in the air, ringed by 40 windows that turned sunlight into something that seemed to fall from heaven itself. Then he said quietly, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." That was not arrogance. That was a man accurately describing what he was looking at. The new empire did not disappoint. For 1,000 years, it produced the most sophisticated civilization in the Christian world. Its art, its law, its theology, its engineering. Justinian alone could fill a chapter. He reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in 533. He took Italy back from the Ostrogoths in a campaign that lasted 20 years. He commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, a complete codification of all Roman law, which became the foundation of legal systems across most of the Western world. He built the Hagia Sophia. He did all of this before the plague arrived. In 541, a sickness came out of Egypt. It moved through the empire like fire through dry grass. Bodies piled in the streets of Constantinople faster than the living could bury them. Justinian himself caught it and survived. But the empire he had rebuilt did not survive intact. The armies that had taken back Italy and Africa were gone, bled out by the plague and the cost of fighting on too many fronts at once. By the time Justinian died in 565, the reconquest was already unraveling. His successors could not hold what he had taken. They never could, but 1,000 years is a long time, and history does not stop attacking just because you have survived before. In the 7th century, something extraordinary happened in Arabia. A faith emerged from the desert, carried by armies who believed they were fighting for God himself. Within a single generation, those armies had taken Syria, then Egypt, then Persia. 3 of the wealthiest provinces of the Byzantine world, gone in the span of a human lifetime. The empire did not collapse. It contracted. It pulled back toward the Bosphorus and held on, smaller and harder and more desperate than before. The Arab fleets came twice for Constantinople. The first siege lasted from 674 to 678. The second came in 717. Both times, the city used a weapon the world had not seen before. Greek fire, a liquid compound that burst into flame on contact with water and could not be extinguished by drowning it. Byzantine ships pumped it through bronze tubes onto the Arab vessels, and the harbor burned. Imagine standing on the sea walls watching enemy ships turn into floating torches. The screaming carrying across the water, the smell of burning wood and burning men mixing with the salt air. The harbor chain held, the city held, and the Arab advance into Europe stopped here at these walls at this city because of a fire that burned on water. The empire that emerged from these crises was not the empire Justinian had dreamed of. It was smaller. Its language was now officially Greek rather than Latin. Its culture was distinctly Eastern, shaped by Orthodox Christianity and the rhythms of the Aegean. But it was functional. It was resilient. Under the Macedonian dynasty, which ruled from 867 to 1056, cities across Greece grew and flourished again. Thessalonica may have reached 100,000 people. Athens and Corinth held around 10,000 each. The thread of civilization was thin in places, but it had not broken. Then came the Normans. Then the Seljuk Turks, pressing in from the east. Then, the Pechenegs raiding from the north. The empire fought on every front simultaneously for 2 centuries, and it held, and it adapted, and it survived. Each crisis left a scar. The scars accumulated. But the city on the Bosphorus endured, until the men who were supposed to be its allies arrived at its walls. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade came to Constantinople. These were Christian soldiers, men who had taken the cross to fight for God, men who had sworn to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. They came instead to the greatest Christian city in the world, and they burned it. The sequence of events that led to the sack is almost too ugly to follow. A deposed emperor's son named Alexios promised the Crusaders money and obedience to Rome if they helped him take back his father's throne. They agreed. They put him on the throne. He could not pay what he had promised. The Crusaders, camped outside the walls, ran out of patience. In April of 1204, they attacked. They were inside the walls within a day. What followed lasted 3 days. 3 days of looting so systematic and so thorough that it stripped the city of 12 centuries of accumulated wealth. The bronze horses of the Hippodrome, cast in the age of ancient Greece, were loaded onto Venetian ships and carried to Venice, where they still stand today. The Hagia Sophia's altar was smashed apart for its gold and marble. Libraries that held manuscripts no longer existing anywhere else in the world were burned or scattered. The tombs of the emperors were pried open and emptied. It is estimated that 900,000 silver marks were looted from the city. Think about what that number means. Think about what it represents. Every mosaic torn from a wall. Every book reduced to ash. Every relic stripped from its shrine by men who had sworn to protect Christendom. The Byzantine historian Nicetas Kalniates watched it happen. He was there. He wrote about aristocratic refugees, including the patriarch himself, walking out of the ruined city in a column, jeered at by peasants who bought their possessions for almost nothing. The city that had been the center of the Christian world was now the capital of a Latin empire ruled by a Flemish count named Baldwin, who was crowned in the Hagia Sophia, wearing robes looted from Byzantine storerooms. The empire survived technically. Byzantine aristocrats fled to Nicaea and Trebizond and Epirus and kept the flame burning in exile. In 1261, a Nicaean general named Alexios Strategopoulos approached Constantinople with only 800 soldiers, discovered that the Latin garrison had sailed away on a raid, and walked through a secret passage in the walls in the dead of night. The Latins fled to their ships. Michael VIII Palaiologos entered the city in triumph on the 15th of August and was crowned in the Hagia Sophia. The empire was restored. But walk through that city in 1261 and you feel what has been lost. The population that had numbered perhaps 400,000 before 1204 is now a fraction of that. Whole neighborhoods stand empty, roofless, grass growing through the floors. The great libraries are gone. The wealth is gone. The confidence is gone. The city that had shrugged off Arab fleets and Gothic invasions and a dozen sieges has been broken from the inside by men who called themselves brothers in the faith. Michael VIII spent the rest of his reign trying to reassemble the pieces. He took back the Aegean islands, Thessaly, Epirus, most of Achaia. He recaptured the Crusader fortress of Mistras in the Peloponnese, which would become one of the last bright lights of Byzantine culture. He died in 1282, having done more than anyone had a right to expect. But the empire he restored was not the empire that it existed before 1204. It was a smaller thing, a wounded thing, and the wounds would never fully close. The 14th century arrived with fresh catastrophe, civil war between John V Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzene, the remaining resources apart. The Black Plague arrived in the 1340s and killed a third of the population. Serbia pressed in from the north, and from the east, a new power was forming. The Ottoman Turks began raiding Greece in the late 14th century. Then they began conquering it. Thessalonica, the second city of the empire, fell to them. Ioannina fell. Thessaly fell. The empire shrank to Constantinople itself and a handful of outposts, the most important being the despotate of Mistras in the Peloponnese, where Greek scholars and artists and theologians kept a culture alive that was already being called a Renaissance. In 1445, a man named Constantine, the despot of Mistras, recaptured Ottoman-occupied Thessaly. It was a remarkable feat, a last flash of the old fire. 8 years later, he became emperor, the 11th Constantine, the last man who would ever hold that title. He inherited a city of perhaps 50,000 people inside walls built for 500,000. He inherited a treasury that was empty. He inherited a church divided against itself. The Orthodox hierarchy refusing to accept union with Rome, even though union with Rome was the only hope of getting Western military help. He sent ambassadors to the West begging for that help anyway. They sent condolences. The walls that had held for 1,000 years were not going to hold much longer. A young sultan named Mehmed had spent years preparing for this moment. He had commissioned the largest cannons ever built, bronze monsters that fired stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds. He had assembled an army of 80,000 men. He had built a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus to cut off any relief by sea. He had thought of everything. He had left nothing to chance. Constantine XI looked at the gaps appearing in the ancient stones after the first cannon shots and said nothing. He had fewer than 7,000 men to defend 20 kilometers of walls. The math was not complicated. The math was a death sentence. He sent ambassadors to the West begging for help. They sent condolences. And so, on the morning of May the 29th, 1453, Constantine XI Palaiologos took off his imperial crown, put on the armor of a common soldier so no one would know who he was, and walked toward the walls. He was not going to survive. He knew that. He was going to die with his city. And that is where we began. Now you know what he was carrying with him. Watch him again. The firelight. The hands removing the crown. The man who has been emperor placing that weight down, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in something harder to name. You have seen this image before, at the very beginning. But you did not yet know what it meant. Now you do. 3,000 years of it. Every fragment of it. The palace builders of Crete, who carved dolphins into stone and watched the sea for ships. The democracy of Athens, born in a hillside assembly of arguing, men who believed that argument itself was sacred. The courage of 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, who held a narrow pass against a tide that should have swallowed them whole. The mind of Socrates, who drank poison rather than stop asking questions. The ambition of Alexander, who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. The faith of Constantinople, burning like a lamp for 1,000 years at the edge of the known world. Constantine XI Palaiologos carried all of it. He was the last link in the longest chain in Western history, and he warped into the dark holding every single piece. It is the 29th of May, 1453, before dawn. The air smells of smoke and stone dust and blood. The cannon fire has been going on for 53 days. 53 days of stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds each, slamming into the Theodosian walls, the same walls that had held for 800 years, the same walls that had laughed at Attila, at the Avars, at the Arabs, at every army that had ever looked at this city and wanted it. Those walls are cracking now. The gaps are real. The math, as the emperor had seen from the beginning, was a death sentence. He has fewer than 7,000 men. Mehmed has 80,000. The bronze monsters that the Hungarian engineer Orban built have done their work. Nothing in the ancient world had prepared these stones for this. Gunpowder. Cannons. A new kind of war. Shortly after midnight, the attack begins. The first waves come in the dark. Irregular troops, poorly armed, thrown at the walls like water against a cliff. The defenders hold. Then the Anatolian forces press a section of the older, weaker wall in the northwest, and for a moment they breach it. The defenders push them back. The city is still holding. The city is still holding. Then the Janissaries come. The elite. The ones Mehmed has been saving. The Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, who has fought brilliantly for months alongside the emperor, takes a wound, serious. His men carry him back from the walls, and something breaks in the line. Not the stones, the men. The Genoese begin pulling back toward the harbor. The Venetians retreat to their ships. The Greeks nearest the walls run home to find their families. In the chaos, a small gate, the Karakopater, is found unlocked. Ottoman soldiers pour through it like water through a crack. The city is inside the walls now. The city is lost. Constantine pulls off his imperial regalia. The purple, the gold, everything that marks him as the last emperor of Rome. He puts on the armor of a common soldier. He does not want to be taken alive. He does not want to be a trophy. He wants to die as a soldier, with his men, in his city. He leads the final charge into the incoming tide. No one ever positively identified his body. Think about that for a moment. The last Roman emperor, the last man who would ever hold that title, vanished into the street fighting of a fallen city and was never found. There are legends. An angel turned him to marble and placed him in a cave beneath the earth near the Golden Gate, where he waits still. Two priests saying liturgy disappeared into the walls of the Hagia Sophia as the first soldiers entered, and they will return on the day the city comes back to Christian hands. Legends are what people make when the truth is too large to hold. The truth is this: Ottoman soldiers poured through the streets. They reached the Hagia Sophia, that great cathedral that Justinian had built 900 years before. The building so magnificent that the emperor had cried out that he had surpassed Solomon himself. Behind its bronze doors, thousands of civilians had gathered. Women, children, the old, the sick, praying, waiting for a miracle that did not come. The doors were broken open. What happened inside was recorded by eyewitnesses, and the accounts do not spare the reader. The Venetian surgeon Niccolò Barbaro wrote that blood flowed through the city like rainwater after a sudden storm. Mehmed rode into the city on horseback. He entered the Hagia Sophia and looked up at the dome, at the mosaics, at the light falling through those ancient windows. A witness recorded that he marveled at the sight. He ordered a mezend to climb to the pulpit. The call to prayer rose into the vaulted space where Christian voices had been singing for 900 years. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The city became Istanbul. The Roman Empire, which had begun in roughly 27 years before the Common Era and lasted nearly 1500 years, was over. Mehmed reportedly toured the city afterward and wept. He is said to have quoted a Persian poet, something about spiders spinning webs in the palaces of the Caesars, something about owls standing watch in the towers of kings. He had wanted the city. He had it, and he looked at what remained and felt the weight of what he had unmade. But here is the thing about civilizations. They do not end cleanly, they scatter. For years before the fall and in the chaos after it, Byzantine scholars had been leaving. They carried manuscripts, thousands of them, rolled and wrapped and carried across the Adriatic in ships, carried in saddlebags through mountain passes, carried in the hands of men who had memorized whole texts in case the physical pages did not survive. They carried Plato. They carried Aristotle. They carried Euclid and Archimedes. They carried Homer. They carried Sophocles. They carried the entire intellectual inheritance of 3,000 years of Greek civilization, and they brought it to Italy, to Florence, to Venice, to Rome, at exactly the moment when Italy was ready to receive it. The Greek scholar John Argyropoulos came. Constantine Lascaris came. Manuel Chrysoloras had come even earlier, invited to lecture at the University of Florence. The Florentine Chancellor Coluccio Salutati had extended that invitation in 1396, nearly 60 years before the fall. The river had been flowing for a long time. The fall only broke the dam. This is what historians mean when they say the fall of Constantinople helped ignite the Renaissance. It is not a metaphor. It is almost embarrassingly literal. The manuscripts arrived. The scholars arrived. Plato's dialogues, which Western Europe had largely lost for 1,000 years, arrived in Florence and were read by men who would reshape the world. The academy that Plato had founded in Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era had been closed by the Roman Emperor Justinian in 529. 1,000 years later, Cosimo de' Medici founded a new Platonic academy in Florence, stocked with Byzantine manuscripts and taught by Byzantine scholars. The walls came down in Constantinople. The ideas walked out through the rubble and kept going. And they had been walking for a very long time before that. Consider what you are living inside right now. The democratic systems of Western governments trace their direct ancestry to the experiments that began on a hillside in Athens in the 6th century before the Common Era. The scientific method, the idea that you test a claim against reality rather than accepting it on authority, was first articulated by Greek philosophers arguing in the agora, the university system. The idea that a community of scholars should gather to teach and argue and push knowledge forward began with Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. The legal traditions of Western courts carry the fingerprints of Roman law, which itself learned from Greek philosophy, the theater you watch, the comedy and tragedy of it. The way stories are structured with conflict and resolution and catharsis. That architecture was built by Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides in Athens in the 5th century, before the Common Era. The medical oath that doctors still take traces back to Hippocrates. The geometry in every building around you traces back to Euclid. The logic in every argument, the syllogism, the premise and conclusion, that is Aristotle. The New Testament was written in Greek. The early Christian theologians thought in Greek. The word theology is Greek. The word democracy is Greek. The word philosophy is Greek. The word alphabet, the thing this script is written in, comes from the first 2 letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha, beta. It started on Crete, with palace builders who had no iron and no writing that we can fully read. It moved to Mycenae, to those great stone gates with the lions above them. It survived a dark age. It flowered in Athens. It was carried by Alexander to the edges of the known world. It was absorbed and transformed by Rome. It was preserved in Constantinople for 1,000 years, while the West forgot and slowly remembered. It scattered in the hands of fleeing scholars and landed in Italy and became the Renaissance and became the modern world. Somewhere in an Italian library, in the years after the fall, a Byzantine scholar unrolls a manuscript. His hands are careful. The papyrus is old. He smooths it flat on the table, and the smell of it, something dry and ancient, rises in the candlelit room. Outside, Florence is alive with argument and beauty and the particular electricity of a world that is about to change again. He leans forward. He begins to read aloud, in Greek, the language of Homer, the language of Plato, the language of the New Testament, the language that has been spoken continuously by human beings for more than 3,000 years, the longest surviving literary language in the history of the Western world. He reads, and the ideas enter the air, and the air carries them forward. The walls came down. The city fell. The empire ended. But the civilization, the questions it asked, the beauty it made, the ideas it refused to stop defending that did not fall, it never fell. It is still going. You are living inside it right now. You always were.